Welcome to SoCal Voices, Impact of ICE, a student-led investigative podcast where we examine the history and impact of immigration and customs enforcement in Southern California.
Hello and welcome everyone. We're your hosts Emily Maciel and Jacqueline Meiners, and in today's episode we will be diving into the life of journalist John Carlos Frey.
For those of you who don't know Frey, he is an award-winning investigative journalist who focuses on hard news. For the past 2 decades, he has reported on human rights violations, corporate and law enforcement abuses. He has a podcast called The Raid, where he discusses issues with immigration and customs enforcement, also known as ICE. He usually has guests on his podcast who speak about their experiences or involvement within the topic. Other times, he will give a brief overview by presenting facts of what's going on throughout the week. It's important to note that even though Frey is a journalist and is supposed to be unbiased, he makes it very clear in his introduction episode that there will be bias on the side of the oppressed people in his reporting. The entire point of the podcast is to shine light on those who don't have access to sharing their stories.
A little background on John Carlos Frey. Before he became a documentary filmmaker and investigative journalist, he was an actor from the 1990s to early 2000s. He began his journalism career in the early 2010s, focusing on the U.S. border issues and migrant deaths. It wasn't until 2012 that Frey transitioned from his acting career to full-time investigative journalism. Much of his reporting has been done as a reporting fellow with the Investigative Fund at the Nation Institute. Frey is continually working and reporting on the issues with the U.S. border control and immigration raids. We were fortunate enough to listen to Frey talk about his work and life experiences in person, and were able to ask him a few questions along with some other students. He started off by diving into his reasoning for investigative reporting and more specifically reporting on immigration.
The first story I did was the one of the people drowning in the canal, and it had such an impact to expose the fact that the managers of the canal, the government body that managed the canal, could give a shit about people drowning in it. And because of that 60 Minutes report, they put safety features in the canal and people stopped drowning. Because of the report that I did, people stopped drowning. That's why I do investigative journalism, because it has impact. And I won't do a story unless I think that the story will change what it is that we're going to expose. And we tell the story in a way that will cause impact.
Frey then transitioned into telling us how and why he started his podcast called The Raid. He mentioned the big bias against the Latino community when it comes to what you can and can't say in a news story. He also went into depth about the goal of the podcast.
Why immigration and why investigative journalism? Because nobody does it, or nobody was doing it. I think it's a little popular now with the immigration raids. It's everywhere on social media, but when I started, somebody being killed at the border, migrant death, somebody beat up by Border Patrol agents, Border Patrol corruption was rampant. It was a section of reporting that maybe smaller local newspapers were doing and maybe Spanish language media was covering, but it was not national news. As Jose Luis was saying, I started a podcast at the end of last year around Thanksgiving, and because I saw that the immigration raids were being covered in a way that I wasn't necessarily pleased with, and in a way that I thought was not fair. And I've worked in national broadcast news for a long time, and I have been in those rooms where they discuss how they're going to cover a story and what pieces you can put in and what you can't put in, what you can say and what you can't say. And for the most part, if that happens, there's a big bias. And predominantly, I will just be direct, it's predominantly against the Latino community. You can't say things like ICE is racist. You can't say that in broadcast news, even though ICE is allowed to racially profile and to take people who are speaking Spanish and to take people who are brown, which is a form of racism. You can't use those words in broadcast. Our entire goal for the podcast is to expose the federal government's hypocrisy and to expose their corruption. That's a take. I have a bias. I'm not asking whether or not or investigating whether or not the administration is biased or corrupt. I'm going off the premise that they are. And we have a lot of evidence, or I have a lot of evidence to prove it.
Frey gave us a rundown of what a typical workday is like for him. It gave us a sense of what an investigative journalist and reporter job can look like and the multiple pieces that go into it.
about 6 o'clock in the morning so that I could read what happened in the day before. I have to have a constant news feed that I pay for, a news service, a national news service, so I read mostly newsprint from all over the country, mostly local news. National news doesn't cover local stories very often, and that's where you'll find where people are being taken, where people are protesting. Some of the local newspapers and television stations will cover the issue of the immigration raids. So I read for a couple of hours. And then we'll usually record a podcast in the day, which is a couple of hours of prep and research and writing, and then the podcast recording itself, and then a little bit of notes afterwards, editing. I work like that today. I finished a little early today so that I could be here, but it's a good 10-hour day. There are 3 podcast episodes a week. All of them have to be watched when they're in their rough form, which is a couple hours long, and then they have to be edited, and then they have to be prepped to be sent out to the podcast outlets, which is some production. It takes a little while to fix the sound and the picture and all that kind of stuff. They're available on YouTube and Apple Podcasts and all the other outlets. So that whole process of writing the stories and promoting the stories, and then there's the whole social media game that you have to play by posting clips and all that kind of stuff. So I'm constantly, I'm being texted like crazy right now, and I'm nervous because I'm not looking at it. I'm that kind of journalist where I'm married to my phone. But it's what I signed up for. I want to get as much of this information out there as possible, as soon as possible.
An audience member had asked Frey what his process was in getting a source to trust him and getting them to open up to him. So he explained the steps that he takes to do that.
I take them to coffee. I hang out with them. I get to know their families. I sit with them. I don't just put a microphone in their face and start asking them 100 questions. I might wait to do the interview so that I can understand them.
Switching over to the topic of fact-checking, Frey talked about how and why someone should fact-check and verify their sources.
On the podcast, I don't verify anything because I know if somebody wants to sue me for what's on the podcast, I'll get a First Amendment lawyer to defend me, and that's probably the best way to go about it. So I don't want to say that to you because if you end up working for a newspaper or a broadcast outlet, they're going to want you to verify the crap out of your stories.
We go into our first question, where Emily asked Frey about the HBO doc and how he, 1, deals with potential sources telling him no, and 2, how did it feel when someone finally came forward with information about the sit teams?
Emily, regarding the HBO documentary, this is kind of like a 2-part question, but how do you deal with so many potential sources telling you no, and then how did it feel when someone finally came forward with information about the sit teams?
I think if you're a journalist, you have like a sixth sense. You have a hunch that something's wrong, something's off. Just because somebody doesn't come forward and say it on camera doesn't mean that you don't have the evidence. So for a long time, I knew that people involved in Anastacio Hernandez Rojas's death had covered it up. There was plenty of evidence to prove that they had covered it up. What you have to do in broadcast television is that you have to have a face and a voice to say it. I can't say it, even though I might have people tell me off the record that this had happened. So I will keep poking around. I knew that there was a video that was recorded of his beating, and I knew it 2 years in advance of the person giving me the copy of the video. I knew that it existed. I had spoken to the person who filmed it, and they didn't want to come forward. So that's always in the back of my mind, and maybe I'll set it aside for a couple of weeks, and then I'll go back and I'll send another email or another text, and I'll say, hey, have you thought about it? And little by little, I try to wear people down. I'm pesky. I'm irritating. I send a lot of emails that saying, I'm sorry to be such a pest. But listen, I have information that a man was killed by federal agents. I have evidence that a man was killed by federal agents. And I'm a journalist. So do I just put that aside? I gotta find a way. I just gotta find a way. And if this person says no, and that person says no, and they don't want to come forward, I'll just keep asking. That film, the HBO film, took 15 years to get to that point. And the person who came forward who was undercover in the film, whose face is blackened in the film, who revealed evidence about the SIT teams, I already knew about them. I already had documents about them, but I couldn't find somebody to come forward. I have known that man who came forward. I've known him for 12 years. And he has never said yes to any public-facing testimony or bringing evidence forward. He has never said, I want to do this. He's always said the opposite. And this time he said yes.
From there, Frey went into talking about the threats he gets and has gotten while reporting. He also tells us the ways he keeps himself safe while working on a lead for a story.
I was doing a story about child labor in the coffee industry in Chiapas in Mexico. Children were harvesting coffee for Starbucks. And we had proof that 5, 6, 7-year-olds were picking coffee for Starbucks. And that's a multi-billion-dollar business, and usually the stories that have corporate money involved, if you're going to hurt their bottom line, if you're going to take their money away, are the ones that are most dangerous. And I was threatened with my life for doing that story and held at gunpoint and detained. Those happened. That was 3 separate incidents, all for that same story. And our cameras were seized and our footage was seized. It made me want to do the story even more. I am very careful. If we're going to a place like that and we suspect that that's going to happen, I use an alias. I don't use my real name. I take a burner phone. I don't let people know what hotel I'll be staying at or what part of town I'm staying in. I use a different kind of identification to rent a car. Sometimes I don't like to, but sometimes I've traveled with security just to be safe. There was a small amount of my career that was on reporting on Mexican drug cartels, especially on the immigration space. They're responsible for running people across the border. And they kill journalists, and they don't want their stories out. So you sometimes have to wear a disguise when you're out. So I have had to wear a mustache and a hat and glasses and not look like me. So you just have to be careful, and you just have to plan it. It would be ridiculous of me to not be scared and to not be concerned and to not plan, because my goal is to get the story out. So, I guess I could do stories that maybe were not as dangerous, but those are not as meaningful to me. And as far as the comments, every day. I mean, sometimes I read them, most of the time I don't, but every day, you're stupid, you don't know what you're talking about, you're an idiot, you're not Mexican, and they're insulting. Most of the comments are insulting, and I want to fire back. And, I want to say something back, but I just let them go. It's mostly out of ignorance. So the best thing to do if you don't want to see the comments or be, get that sting when you read them, is to just not read them. That's most of what I do. It's a constant, I'm constantly on the phone, constantly texting, constantly looking for stories. So welcome to the world of being a journalist.
Once Frey was done with his presentation, we talked to a few people who attended the meeting. We spoke to Professor Jose Luis Benavides, who was the one who brought Frey to CSUN. He spoke about what he thought was the most significant part of Frey's presentation.
Well, what I like about his approach to journalism is precisely what he gave you, right? His own path. So he's telling you want to pursue a career in mainstream news organizations, right? Pursue it if you want to. Be mindful that these organizations are not really up to doing journalism in many cases, that you will need to fight for your own space there and your own stories that you want to tell. But I think the most significant part of what he was telling us today is this sense that you are, he said in a funny way, he said, like, I feel like stories choose me, right? And I think that to me, that speaks to what journalism is all about, right? If you feel like you're in journalism and if you feel compelled to tell a story just because the story is there, right, and nobody else is doing it, then that is the most interesting part, I think, of doing journalism.
We then spoke to CSUN student Brianna Perez, and we asked her why she attended and if she had any prior knowledge about Frey. She also added what she gained from hearing Frey speak about his work.
coming here, I just didn't really know much about him. But I guess once he was speaking about himself, and then when questions were asked about him, I feel like it was really great to learn more, and I felt a little bit more connected as a journalist. I do feel like what he said was really important because he kind of gave a different perspective, knowing that he's actually been here longer than any of us, right? So I do feel like what he said was really impactful, and for sure I'll just keep it in mind because I feel like in the future I do really want to be a journalist that really impacts others, especially the readers. I want them to do something out of it. I want them to be very knowledgeable about what I say. I want to be like very passionate about what I do.
Thank you for joining us today. This podcast was produced by students in the journalism department at California State University, Northridge. Visit our YouTube channel at SoCal Voices, Impact Device for more episodes.